Have you ever wanted to make your own variable type? Well, today we're doing a short video on structures and showing you how that actually works. I'll get back to this project in a little bit to show you an actual implementation of how I put this into a project, but first let's go over how to actually make this. To make a structure, we want to go in the blueprint menu, and then all the way down at the bottom here you can see structure. And this will be the template for your new variable type. Generally, a structure is meant to just prevent chaotic long lists of variables when variables will always have to be made together. So for something like an item. So let's make this structure an item. Opening that up, we get a menu where we can simply add the variables that this structure is going to hold. So for an item, that would be something a little bit like an image, maybe, and an item ID, and maybe a value for how much you can buy and sell it for, and then maybe a name, and also let's add a description. Well, of course, the image is going to be a texture 2D. The item ID will be a integer. The value will be a float. The name, of course, will be then a string. And the description also will be a string. Now, if we make just any actor or wherever in your project, we can add this as a variable now. So we can make a variable and call it something like our held item. And that can be of type item, which is one of the options under the structure menu. And if we compile that, we can see the default values. We can fill in an image, an item ID, a value, a name, and a description. And in the event graph, if we drag this in, we can, just like we are used to with a lot of other structures, like a vector and stuff like that, we can break it and we can get the individual data out of it. Now, there's a couple of different other ways to do something that is a little bit like this. And you might be thinking, okay, so why should I make a structure and not just an actor and make that as a variable? This variable actually is a container that contains the information that we have here. If you make an actor with these variables on it and then make a actor reference here, like this, making a reference to an actor, I'm calling this a reference and not a variable or a container or whatever on purpose in this case, because actor variables in your blueprint always are just going to be referencing an instance of an actor in the world. Meaning you can't just use them as a data container in and of themselves. They need to be spawned into the world. Whereas a structure really is just a container to hold together a couple of pieces of data. It doesn't need to be instanced, it doesn't need to be spawned in, and that is what makes it useful for this kind of thing. And in much the same way, you might also be thinking, I've heard something about data assets, in which case you're not entirely incorrect, especially specifically for things like making an item. A data asset might have been a better option. But there again, we get to the point that when we make a data asset variable, that doesn't hold information in and of itself. A data asset variable is also an object reference. So it just references an existing asset somewhere else in your project. And that's where we get the difference, right? Because if we go into this variable type here and we try to search for item again, we don't have different options like we do when we go and search for actor. Here we can choose if we have a object reference, a class reference, a soft object reference, or a soft class reference. And that is because object types, all of these, just point to a different place in your project, or a different place in memory, rather, that already has data. Structures hold data themselves, and that is a very important distinction to make. And when you make a structure, you can also use it to create a data table, but I'm going to be making a separate video about data tables because it's a topic in and of itself. So that's a lot of dry theory based stuff, like what is this and what does that mean and when to use this. So let's actually go back to that other project from the beginning of the video, and I will show you a very simple implementation of where I made a structure. So just for a little bit of context, this is a tycoon game where you're supposed to go bankrupt, and the way you do that is by investing in bad things like the Virtual Boy, taking out loans and losing money to the interest, and taking on very bad employees. So we have a coffee addict, positive attitude, tea addict, and cat person, or lazy, forgetful, indifferent, and procrastinator. This seems like a very bad employee, so you're supposed to hire this one, and there we go. And those employees, specifically, the data for them is stored in a structure, and we're going to look at that right now. So in the game mode, I have an array with all of the employees that you have hired so far in the game. And let's, just to show you, make a separate employee variable here real quick that I've made through a structure. And if we drag that in and I break that apart, you'll be able to see that the employee has a name, a number of traits, and a net loss or profits that it generates. The traits is a custom enum variable that I've also created, which is, again, separate from what we're talking about here today. I then also have a function to generate all the data for a employee. So that returns a employee, which we can split and we can see has a name, a number of traits, and a net loss profit because it's the same structure. Can't really show you how that works in detail because that is made in C++ and I'm not going to bother you with that. But this is a very basic implementation of how you can use a structure to put some data together in one variable rather than needing a whole variable array for the name, for the traits, and for the profits, especially since the traits themselves already are an array. So this is also a decent way to create an array of arrays, which can be slightly annoying to deal with otherwise sometimes. And as mentioned before, the real power of structures in Unreal comes in when you try to make data tables with them, which we will be talking about in a separate video next time. And a very big thank you to all of my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help out supporting the channel, there's a link down below in the description to the Patreon page. And a special thank you to Eleanor for supporting at the Cave Digger tier on Patreon.